Imagine it's 1946. The war is over. People have returned home, hoping for a peaceful life. But instead, a new, terrible threat awaits them: famine. It could not be spoken aloud. It was not shown in the newspapers, but it came to millions of families. How did it happen that immediately after the victory, people began to die again? This time not from bullets, but from hunger. After the war, the USSR lay in ruins. Factories, roads, bridges, everything was destroyed. But the main problem was something else. There was not enough food. The war had taken not only lives, but also millions of working hands. There were no men left in the villages. Old men, women, and children had to work. And then nature also struck a blow: the drought of 1946. In the Volga region, Ukraine, Moldova, and central Russia, there was no rain for months. The grain harvest fell almost twice as much as before the war. The fields stood empty. People hoped that the state would help, but the help never came. The worst thing is that there was grain in the country, but it was not sent to the starving, but abroad. Huge shipments went to Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, and other countries. The Soviet Union had to look strong, and for this purpose it had to make generous gifts to other states. For example, in 1946, the USSR sent 40,000 tons of grain to Bulgaria, even though people were starving to death in the country itself. This was necessary to strengthen the influence of the USSR in Europe. No one thought about ordinary people at that time. Workers in factories were given meager rations, but they were not enough even for a day. Officially, there was no famine, so there was no help. Those who tried to go to the villages to get food encountered marauders. The roads were dangerous, people were robbed, sometimes even killed for food. Famine could have been prevented if grain had not been exported abroad, but distributed within the country. The USSR tried to look like a superpower while sacrificing its own people. In 46 to 47, for millions of Soviet citizens, famine was worse than war. People were not just starving, they were struggling to survive in conditions that were unimaginable. In the cities, kilometer-long queues lined up for bread. You had to stand for 6 to 8 hours, but even that did not guarantee that you would leave with food. Sometimes people fainted or died on the spot. It was even worse in the villages. People ate whatever they could find. They ate grass, ragwort, tree bark, even pets. Those who lived near rivers tried to fish, but there were hardly any fish left. They were caught during the first months of the famine. When there was no food left, people began to exchange clothes, furniture, and even houses for a few kilograms of grain. Trains to the countryside were filled with townspeople who went to exchange their belongings for food. But not everyone was coming back. Gangs of marauders were operating on the roads. They attacked people and took everything they had. But the worst began when people stopped finding any food. In desperation, they began to eat other people. According to official NKVD data, there were more than 2,000 cases of cannibalism. In fact, there could have been many more cases because the authorities tried to hide them. The death rate reached horrifying figures. In some villages in the Volga region, up to 20% of the population died of starvation. This means that every fifth family lost loved ones. On the streets of cities, you could see corpses. People just fell and died right on the road. They were collected by special brigades and buried in mass graves. The system didn't just gloss over the disaster, it was afraid to acknowledge it. Even when officials saw that people were dying, they pretended that nothing terrible was happening. But even in such a situation, the authorities did not help people. Moreover, for talking about hunger, you could go to jail. Next, we will tell you how the authorities hid this catastrophe and why those who told the truth were called enemies of the people. In 1947, the Soviet Union officially announced a reduction in food prices. Newspapers wrote that the country was confidently moving towards abundance and that the economic success of the USSR was astonishing the world. But in reality, it was a deception. People came to the stores and saw empty shelves. Yes, prices were lowered, but on goods that did not exist. The authorities were afraid of losing control. In the 1930s, people had already experienced the terrible Holodomor, and if the country knew it was happening again, there could have been a riot. The USSR economy was on the verge of collapse, but no one was going to admit it. Instead, they talked about the victory of the socialist economy. It was important to preserve the reputation in front of the West. After the war, the USSR wanted to look strong. The famine did not fit the image of a superpower that helps other countries. In 1946, the US offered to send grain aid to the USSR, but the Soviet leadership refused, because recognizing aid from capitalists would undermine the image of a successful socialist state. Those who complained to the authorities were accused of anti-Soviet agitation. If someone told his neighbors that people were dying of hunger in the village, he could be arrested. Newspapers and radio were silent. It was forbidden to take pictures or write about the famine. Anything that did not fit into the success of the Soviet economy was declared a lie and enemy propaganda. The famine of 46 to 47 claimed millions of lives, but the authorities did everything to make people forget about it. There are still no exact figures. Historians estimate the number of victims from 1.5 to 2 million people. Villages suffered especially. If in the city it was still possible to get rations, in the villages people simply died out. But the worst thing is that even after 1947, the famine did not stop. In some areas, people continued to die for several more years, but it was forbidden to write about it in the newspapers. The USSR carefully hid the truth. History textbooks did not mention at all that there was a famine in the country. The survivors of this hell received no compensation. No one recognized them as victims. No one helped them recover. They were simply told, forget it. Some people were afraid of starvation for the rest of their lives. They hid food, stockpiled bread, even if it was no longer necessary. Children who survived the famine grew up with severe trauma. They did not understand why their childhood was spent in fear and hunger, while the country pretended that it did not happen. But here's a question. If the authorities were so successful in hiding this famine, what other secrets of the Soviet Union remained unknown?